A letter arrives, but not before death. Welcome to Detective Echoes. I am your host, Benedict. This mystery-loving community keeps growing. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Your messages bring this channel to life. I love reading everyone. Let's dive in. It was on the afternoon of May the 17th, mild and drowsy with a breath of honeysuckle in the air, that the peaceful village of Fallow Glen began to stir from its centuries-old torpor. The bells of St. Mildred's Church tolled 4:30 with their usual mellow lethargy, but on this particular Thursday, something was amiss in the stillness. That sense, not of drama, but of dislocation, like a cough in the middle of a hymn, settled over the village. At the center of it all, the vicarage stood cloaked in ivy, its brass knocker polished to a fault. The Reverend Clement Blythe was nowhere to be seen. A letter sat unposted on the corner of his oak writing desk. It bore his crisp signature and was addressed to the Bishop of St. Albans. But more curious than the unsigned sermon notes or the half-drunk cup of Earl Grey cooling on a lace doily was the sheet of paper tucked into a blue envelope marked, "To be opened in the event of my death." No one yet knew about that envelope, of course. The letterbox had not been checked. Instead, the talk that day was of the missing vicar. He had not appeared at the children's choir rehearsal that afternoon, an oddity in itself, given that Reverend Blythe was as punctual as a Swiss train and had never once missed rehearsal, even during a bout of pneumonia. It was Miss Felicity Hartwell, the organist, who first sounded the alarm when she found the vestry empty and the upright piano untouched. "He must have gone for a walk," she said to the children, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "We'll wait a bit." They waited nearly an hour. It was Mr. Archie Palmer, the village postmaster, who noticed the light still burning in the vicarage at dusk and walked up to knock on the door. He found it locked. No answer came. His gaze fell on the study window, a crack in the curtains, and inside a figure slumped in the armchair, head tilted unnaturally, one hand resting over a closed Bible. By 9 o'clock, Fallow Glen was buzzing, like a disturbed hive. Mrs. Drusilla Fenchurch, who had once shared a first-class carriage with a lady-in-waiting to the Duchess of Kent and considered herself a connoisseur of all scandalous happenings, was quick to declare it a heart attack, brought on by overwork or guilt. "Mark my words," she told Miss Templeton at the grocer's, "there's something rotten in that sermon drawer." Over at the Blue Partridge tea-room, the debate grew livelier. Young Theo Cartwright, the dentist's son, recently returned from a term at Oxford, thought it suicide. The clergy are prone to melancholia. It's statistically demonstrable. Mr. Henley, who ran the local haberdashery and had never missed a Sunday service in 35 years, shook his head gravely. "The Lord calls his own. We oughtn't to speculate." Speculation, however, was the unofficial currency of Fallow Glen. At the periphery of this swelling interest, sitting with folded hands and a faraway look in her eyes, was Miss Marple. She had been invited to tea that very afternoon by Mrs. Vicar herself, though the lady had taken the motor car into Norcombe for her niece's dental surgery. Miss Marple had only stopped by for a polite chat, as she often did when she suspected someone needed gentle distraction. She had not expected to be standing in the vicar's rose garden, staring up at a locked house and listening to hushed voices debate whether the constable should be summoned. Constable Green arrived before long, called in by Archie Palmer. He was young and eager, and if his notebook trembled slightly in his hand, he kept his voice steady. The local doctor, Dr. Hawthorne, pronounced the Reverend dead at approximately 5 p.m. of uncertain but possibly natural causes. There was no wound, no blood, no weapon, and no evidence of struggle. His tea, however, had not been drunk. The police quickly sealed the house. Green did his best to appear authoritative. Best not to speculate. We'll wait for the coroner and the higher-ups from Norcombe. It may be natural, but I'm not taking chances. It was Miss Marple who, in her quiet way, stood last before the garden gate, her fingers lightly touching a drooping frond of lavender. Her eyes lingered, not on the figure being wheeled away, but on the small red smear, no more than a pinprick, on the edge of the vicar's white window curtain. "Odd," she murmured softly, mostly to herself. "One doesn't usually bleed in. Such a manner from the soul." But no one heard her. They were already busy speculating on what sort of life insurance the vicar had carried. What no one yet knew, not the doctor, not the constable, and certainly not the agitated villagers, was that the vicar had indeed written a confession. He had also posted it, or so he had believed. That envelope, however, never reached the post office. It lay forgotten beneath a sheet of hymn paper, one corner stained faintly red. And Miss Marple, who knew a thing or two about people who posted things too late, had already begun to take quiet note of the peculiar silences that fell between questions. After all, the vicar's death had all the marks of a closed door, except for the one detail that refused to close properly. The morning after the vicar's untimely death dawned with an unnatural hush over Fallow Glen. The church bells, which should have tolled the hour for early matins, remained silent. Their absence was as conspicuous as a missing guest at a wedding, particularly one officiated by the absent party himself. The sun cast golden fingers through the mist rolling off the meadow, but it brought no warmth to the eyes of those gathered in solemn clusters along the high street. Miss Marple, always an early riser, had taken her tea alone that morning. The blue china cup trembled ever so slightly in its saucer as she set it down. She had not touched her toast. Instead, her gaze lingered on the lace-edged handkerchief in her lap, folded twice over. Inside she had tucked a single note written on creamy paper in an unpracticed but determined hand, a scrap she'd retrieved discreetly from the garden path, while everyone else had been preoccupied with gasps and theories. It bore no name, only the line, "I cannot carry the truth past this Sunday, I'm sorry." She tucked the note away again, folded with the same quiet precision one might use to put away a family photograph. Not damning evidence. No, not yet, but a whisper of conscience. And in her experience, such whispers were always trying to tell a louder story. At precisely 8:30, the village green began to stir. Mrs. Templeton was seen sweeping her porch with unusual vigor, pausing frequently to glance toward the vicarage gates, now padlocked and guarded, more out of form than threat, by a solitary constable. Mrs. Beasley, who ran the grocer's and liked to think herself well connected with what was what, placed her vegetables out in symmetrical rows, craning her neck at every passer-by, as though hoping to overhear something more valuable than a sale. "It must have been his heart," said Mr. Henry Purley, the retired schoolmaster, over the counter at the bakery. "Men of the cloth carry heavy burdens. It catches up to them." "I, or a secret mistress," interjected Mrs. Cheddle with a laugh far too loud for the hour. "You'd be surprised what vicars get up to behind rose hedges." "Drusilla Fenchurch says he was seen arguing with someone near the churchyard 3 nights ago," chimed in young Evelyn Pickering, eyes bright with scandal. "Rubbish," muttered Mr. Henley, tightening the cravat on his portly neck. The Reverend was a man of dignity and restraint. And anyway, who'd argue with a man like Clement Blythe? He never raised his voice, even when someone nicked the collection tin. As if summoned by the very mention, Miss Marple appeared at the tea-shop threshold. She entered without fuss, wearing a lavender cardigan and soft grey gloves despite the warmth. Her eyes, light as cornflowers, swept gently across the room. She nodded to Mrs. Beasley, greeted Mr. Purley, and took her usual corner table. Her presence, like a bishop on a chessboard, changed the tempo of the room. "Terrible, simply terrible," murmured Mrs. Cheddle in her wake. "She knew him, didn't she?" "Had tea with him just yesterday," whispered Mrs. Templeton. "Can't imagine what she must be thinking." But Miss Marple said little. She stirred her tea once, twice, and watched the curl of milk form patterns in the surface. She was thinking, certainly, but not in words. Her thoughts moved like embroidery, precise and quiet, threading small moments into patterns others did not yet see. It wasn't until just past 10 o'clock that something truly peculiar occurred. A grey motor car bearing the insignia of the Norcombe police pulled up in front of the vicarage. Out stepped Inspector Colin Trench, tall, stork-legged, and always in too much of a hurry for village folk. He adjusted his hat, barked something to Constable Green, and disappeared into the vicarage with the air of someone certain a mystery would unravel itself under pressure. Miss Marple watched from her table without turning her head. "I do hope—" "He's brought his spectacles this time," she murmured aloud to no one in particular. She finished her tea, paid with exact change, and stepped into the day. The village lanes murmured with footsteps as the curious wandered close to the churchyard, then pretended not to be interested. Outside the vicarage gates, Mrs. Hartwell, the organist, stood in evident distress, pressing a lace-trimmed handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple approached gently. "My dear," she said kindly, "you look pale. You shouldn't trouble yourself about what's beyond those doors." Mrs. Hartwell looked over, eyes red. "He was my friend, Miss Marple, and now they're saying things." Miss Marple inclined her head. "People say all manner of things when grief is involved, often as a way of covering their own discomfort." "They're saying he poisoned himself," she whispered, "that he drank something, that there was something wrong in his tea, but he never touched it. I saw the cup." Miss Marple blinked slowly. "You were in the study?" Mrs. Hartwell hesitated. "Just briefly, when the doctor arrived, before the constable sent us out. I wanted to straighten his papers. You see, it didn't seem right, all that disarray." "And did you find anything?" Only something odd. One of the hymn books was missing. The set was always complete, 20 copies. He kept them lined up like soldiers. But there were only 19 yesterday." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Strange how even the smallest details can seem louder after a death." That afternoon, as Inspector Trench emerged with a brown satchel of documents and a strained look, Miss Marple made her way to the church. The doors were open, as they always were during daylight hours. The nave stood empty, bathed in coloured light from the stained-glass windows, and the silence there was not oppressive but contemplative. She walked slowly between the pews, fingertips trailing over the backs of benches. She paused in the front row and turned to look toward the organ. Her gaze drifted to the side aisle, where a single flower had fallen from an arrangement near the pulpit. A daffodil, late for the season. Her eyes narrowed slightly. It was there, in that quiet church, that Miss Marple's thoughts settled, not on poison or heartbreak or scandalous secrets, but on timing. Something was wrong not in the cause but in the sequence. The choir rehearsal was missed, the lights were on, the tea untouched, a note not posted, a hymn book missing, a curtain smeared, and though no one had mentioned it, why had the Reverend not locked the study door, as he always did when he stepped out? Everyone knew he was fastidious about that, particularly when, writing correspondence, the questions stacked gently in her mind like china teacups, not yet full but ready. Outside, the villagers continued their guessing games. Inside, Miss Marple whispered softly, "There are some sins, you know, that prefer to be confessed too late." The arrival of the coroner's preliminary findings 2 days later brought no finality to the matter. only fresh ambiguities. Dr. Lawton, a tidy man of few words and even fewer speculations, reported non-traumatic death consistent with ingestion of a toxic substance, but was quick to add that the exact compound had not yet been identified. The press, sensing potential scandal, camped just outside the Norcombe police office, but Fallow Glen, ever insular, resisted intrusion with the stubbornness of old hedgerows. The cause was labelled suspicious, the means unknown, the motive. The motive was what everyone was trying to guess. Yet while Inspector Trench compiled names and statements in thick folders and Constable Green patrolled the vicarage with increasing unease, Miss Marple began to take her usual route, past the old mill stream. Her basket, draped with a cloth embroidered with violets, held only knitting, at least apparently. She walked with a rhythm as natural as a lullaby and paused in familiar spots where gossip tended to drift like pollen on the wind. It was at one such corner, near the stone bridge where ducks often gathered, that she encountered Lydia Markham. Miss Markham, a woman in her late 30s with a prematurely furrowed brow and ink-stained fingers, taught history at the village school. She was known for wearing unflattering cardigans and correcting grammar at inappropriate moments. She had, also somewhat more quietly, been a close friend of the late Vicar. "Good morning, Miss Markham," said Miss Marple gently, adjusting her basket. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anything scholarly." Lydia turned, startled, then relaxed. "Oh, Miss Marple, no, not at all. Just needed some air. Too many curious little faces in one room. You must have known Reverend Blythe." "Well," a subtle tension flitted across Lydia's face. "Yes, he was a thoughtful man, and kind, too kind, perhaps." "How do you mean?" Lydia hesitated, as though a truth threatened to tip from her tongue but chose instead to retreat. "Only that he cared about people who didn't always deserve it." Miss Marple nodded as if in agreement, though her mind snagged on that phrasing. Lydia gave a tight smile. "People say he took his own life, but I don't believe it. He wasn't that sort. He believed too deeply. He believed people could change." "And do you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice light but inquisitive. Lydia looked away. "Not often, not really." They parted without further comment, but Miss Marple noted, not for the first time, how often grief sharpened the edges of truth, and how often regret wore the mask of restraint. Later that afternoon, a small commotion drew attention near the vicarage gate. Archie Palmer, the postmaster, stood arguing with Inspector Trench, a sheaf of letters in his hand. "I told you this wasn't delivered with the rest," he said, holding up a blue envelope. "Found it behind the parcel shelf, must have slipped. Postmarked 2 days ago, but never left the building." Inspector Trench snatched it. His expression shifted when he read the address. Bishop Harold Godwin, Office of Ecclesiastical Oversight, St. Albans. Miss Marple, passing at a respectful distance, paused by the hedge. She could not see the letter, but she saw the way Trench stiffened, his mouth twitching downward. Inside the envelope, of course, was the vicar's confession, unfinished, dated the morning of his death, and marked with a trembling signature. But it contained no explicit crime, no concrete act, only vague references. "I can no longer live with the burden, and the truth must out, whether by my hand or another's." The inspector called it a suicide note. Miss Marple was not so certain. By early evening the village was buzzing once more. The confession had the unfortunate effect of confirming everyone's personal suspicions, regardless of their merit. "It was guilt over the Maynard Trust," announced Mrs. Cheddle at the bakery. "You know they say the money went missing last year." "Nonsense," huffed Mr. Purley. He was heartbroken over Miss Markham. Everyone knew they were close. "More likely it was something to do with that altercation in the graveyard," whispered Evelyn Pickering to anyone who would listen. Miss Marple returned home and sat by her window, watching the world blur into twilight. Her knitting lay untouched on her lap. Instead, she reflected on the vicar's last days, the missed rehearsal, the locked room, the unmailed letter. A mind as methodical as Reverend Blythe's would never forget to post something that important. Nor would it end a note so ambiguously. And what of the curtain smear and the missing hymn book? She thought of Mrs. Hartwell again, and her oddly specific recollection of 19 hymnals. Had she meant to hint at something? Or had she been warning Miss Marple in the only way she dared? Just after supper, a light tapping came at Miss Marple's door. It was young Constable Green, cap in hand, shifting uncomfortably. "Sorry to intrude, Miss Marple. I know it's not proper, but I'd value your opinion." Just quietly. Miss Marple offered him tea and motioned to the chair beside the fireplace. "Now what is it, my dear?" Green looked troubled. "It's about the study door. The inspector's report says it was locked, but I swear when I arrived it wasn't. It was just shut. I pushed it open myself. I know I did." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And yet the inspector's report says otherwise." "Yes, ma'am, he says I must be mistaken, but I'm not. I even remember the handle. It sticks a little, you see. Always has." She leaned back, fingers steepled. "That is most curious," he nodded. "And there's something else." The vicar's desk drawer, it had scratch marks, as though someone had pried it open. Not broken, just tampered with. Was anything missing? Not that we know, but if someone were looking for that letter, before it was found, maybe they thought it was in the drawer. Miss Marple gave him a small smile, soft but laced with meaning. "You're more observant than most give you credit for, Mr. Green." He flushed. "Thank you, ma'am." When he left, Miss Marple stood and crossed to her bookcase, retrieving a slim volume of hymns. She counted 20 on her own shelf, all present. The missing copy from the church was troubling, not because it was gone, but because no one seemed particularly interested in retrieving it. It would be, she thought, an ideal place to conceal something thin, like a letter, or a page torn from another book, or instructions, or blackmail. She paused. Blackmail. Miss Marple's thoughts unfurled like lace in a breeze. There had been other cases over the years, not always murders, sometimes only ruin, but she had seen the damage that could be wrought with one well-timed threat. The vicar had meant to confess. Someone had meant to stop him. The letter had been mislaid, yes. But what if it had first been intercepted, and only discarded when its contents proved less damning than feared? And the missing hymn book, what if it was never missing at all? What if it had been used and then hidden? She sat down slowly. Her fingers trembled only once as she reached for her teacup. The village, she knew, would soon lull itself into belief. The kind, gentle vicar had taken his own life. They would lay him to rest with soft hymns and charitable silence. But Miss Marple, who believed most in human frailty and the desperate things people did when cornered, was beginning to suspect something far more intentional had occurred. After all, as she had once told her nephew Raymond, one must always be careful with the truth, especially when someone else is trying very hard to bury it. 2 days after the coroner's announcement, Fallow Glen attempted, with rather forced cheerfulness, to resume its regular rhythm. Nothing, however, in a village like Fallow Glen ever truly returned to normal, particularly not when the death of a beloved vicar hung in the air like unseasonal frost. Despite the somber mood, the Rose Fete, an annual event held in the garden of the Women's Institute, went ahead as scheduled. The planning committee, having debated decorum for several hours, concluded that the Reverend would have wanted it so. More privately, It was also decided that a gathering might lift spirits and help smooth over rumors. In truth, it provided the village with its most useful occupation, observing one another under the guise of sociable activity. The fete was as charming as could be expected under the circumstances. Bunting swayed lightly from tree to tree, tables groaned under the weight of scones and sponge cakes, and the scent of rosewater and lemon balm wafted through the hedgerows. Yet for all the outward cheer, the mood was stilted. The vicar's absence felt like a shadow stitched between every polite greeting. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, wearing her pale grey hat with the violet ribbon and a gentle expression that betrayed none of her ongoing deliberations. She took a small plate of currant loaf from Mrs. Templeton, commented kindly on the spread, and made her way toward the garden's edge, where the rose competition was being judged. It was there that she encountered Mr. Leonard Crocombe, the churchwarden, and one of the few people in Fallow Glen who prided himself on appearing more burdened than he was. A tall, ruddy-faced man with heavy brows and a fondness for quoting scripture out of context, Mr. Crocombe had been notably absent from the earlier police interviews. He now stood next to the bishop's rose, a particularly lush crimson bloom, looking unusually ill at ease. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, fidgeting with his watch chain. "Quite the turnout, eh? Remarkable, considering everything." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, eyes settling gently on the bishop's rose. "The gardens are at their finest. Do you enter the competition yourself, Mr. Crocombe?" He gave a forced chuckle. "No time for flowers, I'm afraid. Between the vestry accounts and recent events, I've barely time to breathe." "And how are the vestry accounts, if I may ask?" Crocombe blinked. "Oh, steady enough, nothing troubling." "But didn't the Reverend raise concerns about the charitable fund last winter? I recall mention of it at a tea meeting." Crocombe flushed. "All sorted now. Miscommunication, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, not pressing further, but she noticed how his hands tightened as he spoke, and how he glanced sideways when a child accidentally kicked a ball toward the prize display. A moment later, Miss Lydia Markham appeared on the other side of the garden, her cardigan slightly askew and her hands jammed deep into her pockets. She was not speaking to anyone, but her eyes moved restlessly across the crowd. When she saw Mr. Crocombe, her expression darkened for a moment, then softened as she noticed Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," she said with something like relief, "might I have a word just over here?" They moved to a quieter spot near the rose arbor, away from the crowd. Lydia's voice was low, urgent. "I've remembered something." "Oh?" "The vicar, Clement. He received a letter 3 days before he died. It arrived during lunch while I was visiting. He looked disturbed by it. He said it was nothing, but I saw the name on the return address before he tucked it away. Gregory Mallow." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "The name is unfamiliar. He was a solicitor once, practiced in London, struck off. For forging documents, I think. He and the Reverend had a connection years ago, something to do with Clement's brother." Miss Marple's mind clicked gently into motion. "That's very interesting. Did he say what the letter was about?" Lydia hesitated. "Only that it was a voice from a past best left silent. I thought he meant it poetically." Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "Poetry is very often a veil for regret." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp, awkward laugh from across the lawn. Mrs. Drusilla Fenchurch, bedecked in brooches and a wildly inappropriate feathered hat, had taken it upon herself to hold court near the tea-urn. "I simply can't abide all this hush-hush business," she was saying to a group of obliging listeners. "If he was going to confess, why be vague? If you ask me, it all smacks of someone trying to pretend they had nothing to hide while hiding everything." "Perhaps the note wasn't meant to be vague," Miss Marple said quietly, stepping forward. Perhaps it was simply unfinished. Mrs. Fenchurch startled, then laughed too loudly again. "Ah, dear Miss Marple, always listening, aren't you?" "One learns a great deal by doing so," Miss Marple said mildly. "For example, I believe the vicar intended to meet someone the day he died. I believe that meeting never took place, or if it did, it ended more dramatically than expected." The crowd tittered, uncertain whether this was gossip or declaration, but Miss Marple was already walking away, offering no further elaboration. She passed the cake stall where Constable Green was trying to look inconspicuous behind a Victoria. "Sponge." He brightened when he saw her. "I've been meaning to find you," he said, voice hushed. "We've just finished searching the church loft." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And?" He handed her a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was a worn copy of Hymns Ancient and Modern, numbered 19 on the inner spine. A slip of thin folded paper was tucked between pages 214 and 215, where the hymn Lead Kindly Light rested. Miss Marple opened it. It was not a letter nor a confession, it was a bank statement. But it bore the name Leonard Crocombe, a series of deposits, one significantly large withdrawal, and a notation, WJF settlement cleared. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Curious placement for such a document. Constable Green nodded. Hidden well. Took us hours to find it. And I suspect no one would ever have looked, she murmured, if Mrs. Hartwell hadn't remembered the number of hymn books. As the fete wound down and the roses began to droop in the afternoon heat, Miss Marple stood quietly beneath the arbour. She watched Mr. Crocombe laugh stiffly with Mrs. Fenchurch, his eyes never quite meeting anyone else's. She noted Lydia Markham walking away alone, arms tightly crossed, and somewhere in her mind a shape began to form, not yet sharp, but ominously real. She knew now that the Reverend had not died because of a single act or a single person. No, this death had roots, deep ones, tangles of regret, greed, and something long hidden beneath appearances, and the missing piece, whatever it was, had been dangerous enough for someone to go hunting through hymn books for it. She would have, to tread carefully now. Fallow Glen smiled at its own fate, but the smiles were not genuine. Somewhere among the rose petals and teacups, someone had lied, and Miss Marple, who understood better than anyone that the darkest truths often wore. The politest faces would soon begin to draw them out, thread by thread. The following morning the village awoke to a fine drizzle, and the muffled chime of the church bell striking 7. It was the first time the bell had sounded since the vicar's death, and the sound, soft, almost hesitant, spread across Fallow Glen like a sigh. Miss Marple, rising early as always, took her tea by the lace-curtained window of her cottage on St. Christopher's Lane. The garden outside shimmered under the damp, but her attention was fixed inward. On the table beside her rested the bank, statement discovered in the missing hymn book. It was yellowed slightly, the ink beginning to fade. She had read it several times the night before, and each time new implications had surfaced. Leonard Crocombe had always projected the image of a trustworthy, dutiful man, the sort of churchwarden who tutted at lapsed parishioners and could be counted on to arrange funeral chairs with military precision. But the statement suggested something far murkier. The initials WJF remained a mystery. The notation settlement cleared felt more like a closing chapter than a banking formality. And most importantly, what kind of settlement? Miss Marple, never one to rush to judgment, knew that patterns in human behavior often echoed patterns in nature. Secrets, like bulbs, grew best underground. But when they broke the surface, they rarely did so without consequence. By mid-morning, she found herself outside the church hall, where the children's choir had resumed its rehearsals under the temporarily assigned curate, Reverend Hallam, a well-meaning but slightly overwhelmed young man. Inside, the voices of 7 boys and 5 girls wove their way through all things bright and beautiful, with more enthusiasm than precision. Miss Marple waited until the children had finished before quietly entering the hall. She was not particularly interested in the music, though she said all the right things to the flustered curate, but rather in speaking to young Edward Lacey. Edward, aged 10 and freckled, was the youngest and most observant of the choir boys, known among his peers for his excellent memory and tendency to repeat adult conversations verbatim. He also happened to be the son of the local baker, and had been present at the last rehearsal, the one the vicar had missed. "Good afternoon, Edward," Miss Marple said with a kindly smile. "Might I borrow you for a moment? I promise not to take you away from anything too exciting." Edward shrugged and followed her to the front pew. "You were here the afternoon the vicar didn't come to rehearsal, weren't you?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "Miss Hartwell said he'd probably just gone out for air." "And what did you all do while waiting?" "Practiced. But then I had to fetch more hymn sheets from the vestry cupboard." "Did you go alone?" He nodded. "Miss Hartwell gave me the key." "And did you notice anything unusual?" Edward wrinkled his nose. "There was someone in the back corridor. I thought it was the vicar at first, but it wasn't." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Oh, who was it?" "I don't know," Edward said, frowning. "It was just a man, wearing a coat even though it was warm. I didn't see his face properly, but he had a limp, left leg, I think. He walked funny." Miss Marple felt a quiet chill rise beneath her cardigan. "And he didn't speak to you?" "No, ma'am. He was just looking at the board near the church office, then he left by the side door." She patted his shoulder. "That's very helpful, Edward. You have an excellent memory. When?" She left the church hall. The drizzle had ceased and the sun had broken through, casting streaks of gold across the flagstones. Miss Marple walked toward the vicarage, where she found Constable Green pacing by the iron gate. "I was hoping to see you," she said softly. "I wonder if you might accompany me to the archive cabinet in the vestry." Green looked puzzled, but nodded. Together they entered the vestry under Trench's reluctantly granted permission, secured earlier by a rather pointed phone call from Miss Marple to the chief superintendent in Norcombe, with whom she had crossed paths during an earlier unpleasantness involving rhubarb wine and arsenic. Inside the vestry, the cabinet yielded what she had hoped: photographs from church events over the years, charity luncheons, Sunday school anniversaries, and summer fetes. She flicked through them with careful fingers until she reached a group. Portrait dated 1996. The occasion was the rededication of the church roof, and the image captured 30 villagers standing beneath bunting and a restored steeple. "There," she said, tapping a figure at the edge. A tall man, slightly hunched, with a gaunt face and unmistakable limp. "That," she murmured, "is Mr. Gregory Mallow." Green blinked. "The man from the letter?" "The same. He was here before. Years ago. Long before Edward's memory would have formed. But I remember that rededication. And I remember Mr. Mallow. He was invited by the Reverend's brother." Green gave a low whistle. "Do you think he's come back? Why now?" Miss Marple stared at the photograph, then at the row of framed vicars on the opposite wall. Because Reverend Blythe had begun to make peace with something, and Mr. Mallow couldn't afford for peace to mean disclosure. As they left the vestry, Green took her aside. "One more thing. We found something else in the vicarage, beneath a stack of older church records, a second envelope, addressed to Miss Lydia. Markham." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Was it opened?" "No. Postmarked the morning of his death." She took it in her hands. The writing was faintly shaky but unmistakable. "It must be given to her," she said quietly. That evening, as the light waned and the robins resumed their perches, Miss Marple visited Lydia Markham's small cottage near the edge of the village. The woman opened the door, her face pale and weary. "I've brought you something," Miss Marple said gently, offering the envelope. "It's from Reverend Blythe." Lydia stared at it for a long moment before taking it inside. She did not read it in Miss Marple's presence, but her hands trembled as she held it, and her breath caught as if she feared the air itself might be poisoned. Miss Marple left without pressing her. That night, long after the lamps had been extinguished across Fallow Glen, Lydia sat alone in her front room, the letter open on her lap. Its contents were few: an apology, a confession of weakness, and a final line that chilled her to the core. "You were right to warn me." He came, but not to ask forgiveness, to silence. In her sitting room, Miss Marple lowered her knitting needles. Somewhere in the village, a man had returned to bury a sin, and another had died to shield the living. The time for whispered theories had passed. It was nearly time for confrontation. By the next morning, the village of Fallow Glen was on edge, though no one would say it directly. The drizzle had returned with quiet persistence, soaking the hedgerows and turning the garden paths into slick ribbons of mud. Still, it wasn't the weather that dampened spirits. It was the creeping suspicion that something far darker than grief was settling into the heart of the village. Miss Marple, ever attentive to the subtle shifts of human nature, took note of how conversations at the Blue Partridge tea-room now trailed off when certain names were mentioned, and how Mrs. Fenchurch's usual effusions were suddenly punctuated with darting glances. Everyone had seen the envelope pass to Lydia Markham, though none would admit to watching. She took her tea slowly, allowing time for the conversations to swell and contract around her. At the next table, Mrs. Templeton leaned in to whisper to Evelyn Pickering, "She's not been right since the letter, poor thing. Looked as pale as paper last evening, and I swear she was crying behind her curtains." "Oh, but wasn't she always fond of the Reverend?" Evelyn responded with the cruel eagerness of the young. "Perhaps it was some unspoken romance. Do you think he proposed before—" Miss Marple coughed lightly into her napkin, an action timed with such perfect civility that both women flushed and fell silent. Shortly after, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to the small cottage belonging to Lydia Markham. She found the woman seated on a bench in her modest front garden, wrapped in a wool shawl despite the lingering damp. "You've had a difficult night," Miss Marple said, not as a question, but as a kindness. Lydia looked up slowly. Her face was drawn but resolute. "The letter. I think I always knew he meant to do something. But not this." "You mean confess?" "Yes. And not just to the bishop, to the village, to me." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the shawl. "It wasn't what was in the letter that broke me, Miss Marple. It was what it implied, that he had given up hope of putting things right." Miss Marple lowered herself to sit beside her. "May I ask, gently, what you believe he was trying to put right?" Lydia stared at the patch of marigolds near her feet. Years ago, Clement's brother, Jonathan, was involved in a legal scheme. Property sales, forged deeds, people lost their homes, and Gregory Mallow, the solicitor he used, took the fall, was disbarred. I believe, though Clement never said it outright, that he knew more than he let on, that he helped cover for his brother. Miss Marple nodded once slowly. "And you think Mr. Mallow returned to extract payment for that cover-up?" "I don't think he ever left," Lydia said, voice barely above a whisper. "I think he's been watching for years." And when Clement finally summoned the courage to speak, Mallow silenced him. Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence for a moment. "And yet, there's one thing that troubles me." What's that? The letter you received. The vicar. I never sent it. It was found in his study among church records. Why, I wonder, did he not hand it to the postman, or better yet, to you directly? Lydia's brow furrowed. Perhaps he hadn't the chance. Or perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, someone meant to destroy it but missed it, just as they missed the one intended for the bishop. One mislaid, one forgotten, but both intended for destruction. The implications of that settled between them like a fog. That afternoon, Miss Marple arranged to take tea at the home of Mrs. Hartwell, the church organist, a woman of severe habits, austere clothing, and a habit of stating unpleasant truths without flinching. She lived in a prim stone cottage with a front parlour so tidy it might have been preserved in amber. "Blackberry jam?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, already spooning it onto a plate of scones. "Lovely," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm. "And how is the music coming along for Sunday?" Mrs. Hartwell sighed. "Poorly, no one can focus. Half the choir thinks the vicar was poisoned. The other half says he took sleeping pills. I told them all to hush and sing, 'The King of Love my shepherd is.'" Miss Marple took a sip of her tea. "You were very precise when you mentioned the missing hymn book. Most people wouldn't have noticed the number." "I've been counting them for years," Mrs. Hartwell said tartly. "I'm the only one who puts them away properly. Everyone else just stacks them crookedly. I notice when one's gone." "And do you know who last borrowed a copy?" Mrs. Hartwell considered. "The vicar, I believe. He often took one when preparing a sermon, but he always returned it." Miss Marple dabbed the corners of her mouth. "And did anyone ever mention Gregory Mallow to you?" A flicker passed over the older woman's features. "That name. No, but there was a man years ago who attended 2 services and then vanished. Tall, limp. Looked like he carried secrets in his coat pockets. He and the vicar spoke behind the lich gate after service once. I saw it. The vicar looked stricken, but when I asked, he said only that the man had been a ghost from the past." The phrase echoed the wording in the letter Lydia had mentioned. Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell. You've been more helpful than you know." That evening, she reviewed her growing list of facts in her neat sitting room, where the clock ticked with patient certainty. The vicar had written, but not posted, 2 letters, one to the bishop, one to Miss Markham. Both were nearly lost. Both were damning. A man with a limp had been seen in the church corridor shortly before the vicar was found dead. A bank statement had been hidden in a hymn book, with entries that tied Leonard Crocombe to unknown financial dealings. Gregory Mallow had once taken the fall for the vicar's brother, and now he had returned, presumably to collect a debt. But which man, she wondered, had the most to lose from the truth being revealed? The blackmail theory held, but Miss Marple's instinct suggested something more twisted. What if the blackmailer wasn't Mallow, but someone who feared Mallow's presence would unravel their carefully preserved secret? That night, she took out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a note. "Dear Mr. Crocombe, I wondered if you might join me for tea tomorrow. There is a matter of church finance I'd like your wise opinion on. Yours most sincerely, Jane Marple." She sealed it and placed it by the door, for in every village, Miss Marple knew, there are those who sin and those who cover sins in the hope that time will erase them. But time never erases, it only delays, and now the truth was finally beginning to stir. At precisely 3 o'clock the following afternoon, Leonard Crocombe arrived at Miss Marple's front gate, his umbrella folded neatly at his side and his expression carefully composed. The rain had stopped at last, and a few tentative patches of blue sky peeked through the otherwise slate-colored clouds. The roses along the picket fence glistened, their petals heavy with recent moisture. Crocombe was dressed, as always, in his Sunday best, dark jacket, crisp collar, and a pair of polished brogues that clicked sharply on the path as he approached the front step. He greeted Miss Marple with the strained cordiality of a man unsure whether he had been invited for companionship or confrontation. She met him with her usual softness and ushered him into the parlour where a modest tea had been set. Cucumber sandwiches, buttered scones, and a gooseberry tart with a crumbling sugar top. "I do hope you're fond of tart things," she said, as she poured. "I find they help with clarity of thought." Crocombe smiled stiffly. "I've no objection to a bit of bite now and then, Miss Marple." She nodded and offered him a second spoonful of cream, which he declined. For a few moments they spoke politely of the weather, the declining quality of the post, and the noise the milk lorry had begun making on Tuesday mornings. Then, with that particular grace reserved for women of great intelligence and long practice, Miss Marple steered the conversation gently toward the subject of the vicar. "I do miss his sermons," she said with genuine warmth. "He had a gift for quiet conviction. One always left with something to ponder, even if one disagreed." Crocombe stirred his tea. "He was devoted. There were things, I think, that weighed on him. One could tell." "Yes," she agreed, her eyes softening as she studied him. "I've wondered about that, and about the various responsibilities he shouldered, financial ones especially. He mentioned once at a ladies' guild meeting a concern about the charity accounts, something about the Maynard Trust being out of balance." Crocombe's hand paused over the sugar tongs. "Yes, well, that matter was resolved. A clerical error, nothing more. I looked into it myself." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, setting her cup gently in its saucer. "Only I find myself puzzled, Mr. Crocombe. You see, I recently came across a bank statement with your name on it, hidden in a hymn book, no less. I can't help but wonder why such a harmless document would be concealed so carefully." His face paled, though he kept his composure admirably. "A private matter, one not connected to church finances." "I see. The deposit marked WJF. That isn't church business either, then?" Crocombe's fingers curled around his teacup. "No, it was a legacy, settled quietly." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You were aware, then, that the vicar had received a letter shortly before his death, one from Gregory Mallow?" Now he looked at her fully, alarm creeping into his expression. What letter?" "I believe it may have prompted Reverend Blythe to finally speak the truth about something long hidden. Unfortunately, he never got the chance. Perhaps someone feared what he might say." Crocombe stood suddenly, rattling his cup. "Is this an interrogation, Miss Marple? Because if it is, I'd rather speak to the police directly." She remained seated. "I imagine you will, but I thought you might prefer the opportunity to clarify things quietly first. There's no accusation in my voice, Mr. Crocombe. Only concern. You see, the truth has a habit of surfacing, and I've always believed it's better to meet it head-on than let it unravel one's life thread by thread." He hesitated at the threshold, one hand gripping the doorframe. "I didn't kill him," he said suddenly. "If that's what you're suggesting." "I haven't suggested anything yet," Miss Marple said gently, "but you've just confirmed you thought I might." When he had gone, without finishing his tart, Miss Marple sat in silence for some time. She had not missed the flash of fear when Mallow's name was mentioned, nor the slight tremor when he'd heard of the letter, and she certainly hadn't missed his defensive shift when the bank statement was raised. But there was something else, something subtler, lurking just beneath the surface of his performance. She turned the clues over in her mind like pieces of porcelain on a tray. An hour later she took a walk to the church. The rain had softened the earth, and her shoes sank slightly into the grass as she crossed the graveyard. Inside the church it was cool and quiet, the pews dusted with faint flecks of pollen and candle soot. She passed the altar and walked to the vestry once more, where Constable Green was reviewing a stack of papers. "You've been diligent," she said, causing him to jump. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, just going over the access logs. Such as they are, nothing conclusive, I'm afraid." "Sometimes it's not the records that are missing," she said, "but what they imply. Have you spoken to the bishop's secretary yet?" He nodded. He confirmed the vicar had mentioned a pending confession, said it involved a financial misdeed, but that he refused to elaborate in writing, claimed it was something he'd helped cover up, not something he had done himself. "And was Gregory Mallow's name mentioned?" "No, but," Green added, lowering his voice, "we found something else today in the pages of an old communion ledger." He handed her a note. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably Blythe's. "To whomever finds this, if I fail to deliver my confession to the bishop, it must be understood. The money was used to protect someone, not myself. The man who comes calling has no right to accuse. He is as guilty as the rest." Miss Marple's lips pressed together. He was protecting someone. "Do you think it was his brother?" "Perhaps once, but I don't think the Reverend was still shielding Jonathan. I believe he had shifted his protection to someone closer, someone here." The silence in the church grew heavier. Later that day she paid a visit to Lydia Markham. The younger woman looked pale and hollow-eyed, but opened the door with something almost like relief. "I need to ask you something quite specific," Miss Marple said as she entered. "Did the Reverend ever speak of Leonard Crocombe in connection with his brother?" Lydia frowned. "Not exactly, but there was an argument once. I overheard it. Clement told Leonard that silence wasn't the same as innocence, that some debts couldn't be buried by time." Miss Marple nodded. "And did he ever say why he allowed Mr. Crocombe to manage the church accounts?" "No, only that it was better to keep some wolves in the fold than let them roam." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window as the light faded, knitting forgotten in her lap. She could now see the shape of the thing. A buried crime involving the vicar's brother, hush money moved through Leonard Crocombe, and Gregory Mallow returning to press the old wound until it bled. But someone, perhaps not Mallow, had decided that too much was about to come undone. And there was still the figure seen by young Edward, the man with the limp. Why had no one else seen him? Unless... Miss Marple rose suddenly and went to her bookshelf, pulling out the photograph from the rededication service. She studied the man at the edge, tall, hunched, limping, but the face, though grainy, was not quite the one she remembered. She reached into the drawer and removed another photo, a more recent one, a church council meeting from 2 years ago. And there, on the end, was Leonard Crocombe, standing next to an unfamiliar man with a very familiar coat and an unmistakable cane. "Not Mallow," she whispered, "or not Mallow alone." She had missed it. They all had. Because in Fallow Glen, people saw what they expected. Tomorrow, she would go to the police. But tonight she would let the darkness whisper. It was almost ready to speak aloud. The following morning, with the sky washed clean and the air sharp with the scent of whetstone and wood smoke, Miss Marple set out for Norcombe. The market town lay just 2 train stops from Fallow Glen, and though not large by metropolitan standards, it held the nearest diocesan office, as well as the solicitor's registry and, more pertinently, the local archives. Constable Green, who had received a quiet word from Miss Marple the night before, met her at the station. His usual youthful eagerness had been replaced with something more tightly coiled, a tension not born of uncertainty, but of restrained anticipation. "You're sure this is the right course?" he asked as the train gave a judder and hissed into motion. Miss Marple gave him a small smile. "If I'm wrong, Mr. Green, we will have wasted half a day and the price of 2 rail tickets. But if I'm right, and I do believe I am, then the man seen in the church corridor was not who we thought, or rather, not only who we thought." They arrived in Norcombe shortly before 10, and after a brief walk through narrow, cobbled streets still glistening from the previous day's rain, they entered the records office. A clerk with thinning hair and an expression of permanent disapproval peered over his glasses. "We're looking for documentation on one Gregory Mallow," Miss Marple began, "disbarred solicitor, London-based originally, with ties to a financial fraud case in the 1990s. There should also be records of any aliases he may have used since." The man sniffed, but fetched a set of dusty ledgers and a register of revoked licenses. They pored over the records for nearly an hour before Miss Marple tapped the page triumphantly. "Here, Gregory Mallow, disbarred in 1997, fraudulent signatures, and misuse of client accounts. Served 3 years at Haverside Prison. Upon release registered a new name, Graham Malice." Green leaned in. "That's the name on the church council photograph. Malice. He wasn't just visiting, he was attending regular meetings." "More than that," Miss Marple murmured. "He had embedded himself in the community." And then she found it. In a smaller ledger tucked behind a drawer marked MISC, Depositions was a record from 6 months earlier, a declaration of interest filed under Graham Malice for a local property trust that managed charitable land donations. The name listed as co-signer, Leonard Crocombe. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "There's our link. Crocombe and Mallow, or Malice, were working together, at least until recently." Green frowned. "But why kill the vicar now? What changed?" She looked up at him, her expression grave. "Because the vicar finally decided to come clean, and someone, either Mallow or Crocombe, stood to lose everything if he did." They returned to Fallow Glen by early afternoon, the village now hushed with the peculiar calm that settles before a storm, social or otherwise. Miss Marple stopped briefly at the vicarage, where Reverend Hallam, the temporary replacement, greeted her politely. "Everything in order, I hope?" he asked, his mild eyes searching hers. "As much as can be," she said. "Though I wonder, did you come across any correspondence between Reverend Blythe and a Mr. Graham Malice?" Hallam blinked. "Yes, actually. There were some letters, brief, seemed mostly administrative. They were in a folder marked Parish Trust. I gave them to Inspector Trench." Miss Marple nodded and made her way to the police station. She found Inspector Trench in his office, sleeves rolled up, and an expression that wavered between irritation and wariness. "If you've come to offer more theories, Miss Marple, I assure you—" "I've come to offer facts," she interrupted, with a softness that left no room for dismissal. "Gregory Mallow has been living under the name Graham Malice. He's been attending church council meetings and co-signing trust fund documents with Leonard Crocombe." Trench stared at her. "Go on." "There's more. A bank statement hidden in a hymn book shows large transfers between accounts tied to Mr. Crocombe. It is highly likely that Reverend Blythe discovered this and was planning to confess. His letter to the bishop confirms it. He states that a man who comes calling has no right to accuse. I believe he meant Mallow or Malice." Trench leaned back in his chair, the breath escaping from him like air from a pricked balloon. "That name, Malice. I've seen it. In the property. Grant paperwork." Miss Marple nodded. "And now that we know who he truly is, I suspect we'll find other falsified records. But the death, Inspector, that's the crux. Blythe died with no sign of struggle, Yet his tea was untouched, and the curtain bore a smear, just one. Not enough for violence, but indicative of intrusion. And there's the locked door. Green insists it was not locked when he arrived, though your report said otherwise. Trench stiffened. I based my report on the scene after the others were dismissed. Perhaps I assumed too much. Perhaps someone else locked it afterward, Miss Marple said gently, to create the illusion of a private death. Constable Green, having joined them, now added, then the killer was still in the house after the vicar died, long enough to lock up. But who? The question, Miss Marple replied, is not just who was capable, but who was calm enough to stay behind, tidy the scene, and hide incriminating documents. Mallow or Malice had motive, but Crocombe had access. Inspector Trench stood abruptly. I'll bring them both in separately. We'll see who breaks first. Miss Marple laid a hand on his sleeve. Be subtle. Crocombe is proud, and Mallow is practiced. Let them talk themselves into the noose. That evening, Miss Marple returned home to find Lydia Markham waiting at her garden gate. I remembered something, Lydia said breathlessly. It's small but strange. The night before the vicar died, I saw Crocombe walking away from the vicarage, late, after 10. He looked shaken. I called to him, but he didn't respond. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And you didn't think to mention this sooner? I wasn't sure it mattered. People come and go, but it wasn't like him. Leonard never visited the vicar socially. They weren't close. Miss Marple thanked her and went inside. In the calm of her sitting room, she reviewed the sequence again. Reverend Blythe receives a letter from Mallow Malice, begins drafting a confession, seeks to post it but delays, meets with Crocombe, perhaps to confront him, is found dead the next day. Letter is found hidden. Bank statement concealed in hymn book. Someone had come to silence a confession, but someone else had stayed behind to clean up the scene and protect their own position. And perhaps, just perhaps, they were not the same man. Miss Marple stared into the fire, the pieces now aligning with grim clarity. Tomorrow she would arrange a gathering, not just with the inspector, but with every figure tangled in this quiet knot of deceit. And with care she would pull the final thread. The next morning brought with it a pale and luminous stillness, the kind of weather that renders village streets uncanny in their silence. There were no carriages rattling past, no children squabbling on their way to the schoolhouse, and even the birds seemed hushed, as if nature itself sensed the moment that was coming. At 10 minutes to 10, the great doors of St. Mildred's church opened, and Miss Marple stepped through them with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was about to do. She was followed closely by Constable Green, clipboard in hand and nerves tightly bound. In the front pews sat Inspector Trench, arms folded and face drawn with suspicion, not towards Miss Marple, but at the necessity of being present in what he called somewhat unfairly a theatrical performance. But Miss Marple had insisted. She'd requested, not commanded, for she was too wise for that, a final conversation in the setting most symbolic of Reverend Blythe's life. We owe him truth in the house where he offered it, she had said. And so they came. Leonard. Crocombe arrived first. He looked sharp and uncomfortable, his morning coat too stiff, his brow already damp despite the cool air. He did not sit, but instead lingered just inside the doorway, like a man weighing escape routes. Next came Lydia Markham, subdued but steady, her face pale yet resolute. She gave Miss Marple a small nod and took a seat near the pulpit. Behind her came Mrs. Hartwell, the organist, drawn by curiosity rather than duty, her lips tightly pursed, and her eyes flicking between attendees like a hawk in the nave. And finally, Graham Malice arrived, tall, limping, his coat buttoned all the way to the throat. He leaned heavily on his cane and looked, to those with the right kind of eyes, like a man unaccustomed to being summoned. Miss Marple greeted them all with grandmotherly warmth, offered tea from a thermos to the inspector. He refused, and then stood at the foot of the chancel steps. "My friends," she began, her voice mild, "I believe the Reverend Blythe was a good man. Not a perfect man, none of us are, but a man who, when he saw that a past action had caused harm, sought to set it right." She turned slowly to face the small gathering. He intended to confess to his bishop. He wrote a letter, 2 in fact, but he was stopped, not by fear. He had already made his choice. He was stopped by another. Leonard Crocombe shifted in his seat. Miss Marple continued. "For some time now, funds intended for charitable use have been redirected. A bank statement hidden in a hymn book reveals this. The signature matches yours, Mr. Crocombe, and a property trust record in Norcombe confirms that you and Mr. Malice, formerly Gregory Mallow, were co-signatories on recent transactions." Crocombe opened his mouth, but Miss Marple held up a hand. "Please, let me explain what I believe happened. Years ago, Gregory Mallow took the blame for a scandal involving Reverend Blythe's brother, but he did not vanish. He changed his name and embedded himself here. And you, Mr. Crocombe, brought him in, not as a threat, but as a partner. You saw an opportunity. Quiet donations, land grants, discretionary funds, all easily siphoned through the church's charitable arms. No one questioned you. Why would they?" Crocombe's face had gone red. "But things changed," Miss Marple said. "The Reverend learned of it, perhaps slowly, perhaps all at once, and he told someone, Miss Markham most likely. He resolved to speak up. That, of course, put your quiet arrangement in danger." She looked directly at Crocombe. "So you visited him the night before he died. Lydia saw you, you argued. You may have even pleaded with him. But he would not relent. He wrote his letters. He set them aside to be posted." Her gaze shifted to Malice. "And then you, Mr. Malice, returned the next day. I believe your intention was to scare him, to pressure him into silence, as you once had with others. Perhaps you thought a visit would suffice, but something went wrong. The Reverend did not collapse of his own accord. His untouched tea proves that. There were no pills, no wound, but a curtain bore a smear. Just one. A struggle, perhaps. A blow? I never laid a hand on him, Malice said, his voice low but sharp. That wasn't me. Miss Marple turned, calm. No, I don't believe you physically attacked him, but I believe you were present when it happened. There was a beat of silence. Then Lydia spoke, voice barely audible. Then who did? Miss Marple's voice remained soft. Crocombe did. The words fell like a dropped hymn book. Crocombe stood too quickly. I won't sit here. This is outrageous. Miss Marple lifted a finger. And yet, you already admitted it, indirectly. When I asked you about the letter to the bishop, you panicked. You hadn't known the letter was still there. You thought Malice had taken it. That was why you ransacked the desk afterward, while the Reverend lay slumped in his chair. She turned back to Malice. And you found him already dead, or dying. Perhaps you thought it convenient. Why not let him take the guilt to his grave? That would preserve your scheme. But it wasn't clean, was it? You had to cover. Tracks. Hide the bank statement. Lock the study door behind you. Malice's mouth opened, then closed. Trench stood slowly. That true, Malice? I found him slumped in his chair, Malice said at last. I thought maybe he'd had a stroke. But when I saw the letter on the desk, I panicked. I knew what it meant, so I locked the door behind me, hid the document in the hymn book. I didn't kill him. And the curtain, Trench asked. "I wiped my hand when I touched his shoulder, that's all." Miss Marple turned again to Crocombe. "And you, what will you say now?" Crocombe's shoulders sagged. He looked smaller somehow, his years falling onto him like stones. "I never meant to hurt him," he said. "He was my friend, even if he didn't think so. I begged him not to go to the bishop. I said we could repay it, quietly. But he refused. He said some truths had to be spoken out loud." His voice cracked. "I reached for him to stop him leaving the room. He pulled back, lost his footing, hit his head on the desk corner. It was quick." Lydia gasped. "So it wasn't poison?" "No," Miss Marple said gently. "Only a fall. But one he might have survived if someone had called for help." Crocombe buried his face in his hands. "I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I told Malice it was done, that it was over. He came later, to clean up. I didn't ask him. Malice said nothing." Trench stepped forward and placed a hand on Crocombe's arm. "You'll come with me now." Crocombe stood. "I deserve it." After they had gone, silence returned to the church. Miss Marple sat in the pew where Reverend Blythe had once given his gentlest sermons and folded her hands. Lydia came and sat beside her. "You always knew, didn't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not always, but I listen. And people, particularly in villages, always say more than they intend." The stained-glass window above cast muted colours across the aisle. "The truth was there," Miss Marple said softly, "waiting to be noticed." In the week that followed the revelations beneath the stained-glass light of St. Mildred's, the village of Fallow Glen seemed suspended in a strange, uncanny calm. It wasn't quite relief, nor was it mourning, though elements of both hung faintly in the air, like the last smoke from a doused hearth. Leonard Crocombe had been taken to Norcombe under quiet escort. There had been no public scene, no newspaper announcements. Inspector Trench had ensured that for all the damage Crocombe had done, he would not be paraded as a spectacle. As for Graham Malice, formerly Gregory Mallow, he remained under investigation, but had not been charged, yet. His deception had been long and his motives slippery, and though no one doubted his part in the concealment, proving direct legal culpability would take longer. Reverend Blythe was laid to rest 3 days later in a modest ceremony, attended by nearly every villager. The sky had turned a gentle pewter grey, neither threatening rain nor offering sunlight, and a soft breeze passed over the churchyard as if in blessing. Miss Marple stood quietly among the rows of solemn faces, her gloved hands folded gently at her waist. There were no flowers on the grave, per his own wishes, only a simple carved stone and the faint scent of rosemary from a nearby bush. It was Reverend Hallam who delivered the eulogy, his voice trembling but sincere. He was a man of conscience, he said, and though he departed with burdens still upon him, he carried them not for his own sake, but for those he tried to protect. After the service, the village returned to its routines, though now those routines felt subtly altered. At the tea shop, Mrs. Fenchurch spoke in quieter tones. At the post office, Archie Palmer double-checked his letters with uncommon vigilance. Even Mrs. Hartwell played the Sunday hymns with a slight hesitance, as if every note might summon the echo of secrets too long unsung. Miss Marple, for her part, resumed her daily walks and her quiet visits to the shops, but her presence now brought a hush rather than chatter. The villagers knew what she had uncovered, and while they were grateful for justice, for truth, there was also discomfort in the reminder that nothing could hide forever. It was several days later, as she sat trimming rose thorns in her back garden, that Lydia Markham came to call. She stood at the gate for a moment before Miss Marple, noticing her from the corner of her eye, called out, "Don't linger in the shadow, my dear. It makes one look more mysterious than one intends." Lydia smiled faintly and stepped forward. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she said as she settled into the wicker chair opposite Miss Marple, "but I felt I owed you thanks." "No thanks are necessary," Miss Marple replied gently, passing her a cup of tea. "You were one of the few who saw him clearly. That sort of vision is rare and often painful." Lydia sipped slowly. "Do you think he knew what would happen? That Crocombe might—" Miss Marple shook her head. "No. I think he believed Crocombe would listen to reason, or at least walk away rather than act in desperation. He underestimated the strength of fear and the weight of a secret carried too long." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the quiet rustle of the wind through the hedges. Lydia set down her cup. "He once said to me, not long before the end, that guilt ages a person faster than time, that it dries the soul from the inside. I think he was afraid, not of judgment, but of how little he had done to stop what he knew was wrong." Miss Marple nodded. "Many people feel that way, but few do anything about it. The fact that he tried, even when it cost him everything, speaks to his character. He sought to undo what could not be undone. There is dignity in that." Lydia looked away, her voice low. "And what about malice? Will he be charged?" "I imagine they'll find something," Miss Marple said. "There are documents, ledgers. He may not have committed the fatal act, but he built the structure in which it happened, and that in its own way is a kind of murder." Another pause. Then Lydia asked, "Do you think this village will forget?" Miss Marple smiled. "Faintly. Villages never forget, they simply grow quiet. Like gardens in winter, everything remains beneath the surface waiting, but they also heal, with time and the right tending." Lydia exhaled and rose. "You've given me something, Miss Marple. Not just answers, a kind of peace. Thank you." Miss Marple watched her walk down the lane, the shawl over her shoulders fluttering in the breeze. She waited until Lydia disappeared around the bend, then returned to her roses. Later that evening, the Blue Partridge Tea Room reopened its private drawing room for the first time since the vicar's funeral. The Women's Institute met to plan the midsummer fete, and though the mood was somewhat subdued, there was a shared determination to move forward. Miss Marple attended quietly, knitting in hand, listening to the rhythms of conversation begin to return. Mrs. Templeton debated bunting colours with Mrs. Cheddle, while Evelyn Pickering suggested a choir tribute, in memory of the Reverend. The idea was met with warm approval. It was only near the end of the meeting that something curious occurred. Mrs. Hartwell, of all people, cleared her throat and said, "I found something I thought Miss Marple might like returned. It was in the organ bench." She held up a slim, hard-bound volume, Hymns Ancient and Modern. Miss Marple took it carefully. "Thank you. I wondered where this particular copy had gone." Inside on the flyleaf a faint signature, Clement J. Blythe. Beneath it, penciled in soft, almost trembling strokes, a single verse. "The night is long, but the dawn shall come, and truth, like bells, shall ring." Miss Marple closed the book and held it gently in her lap. She said nothing, but her hands rested over the hymn book as if it were a relic from another time, one still echoing with song. When the meeting adjourned, the members filed out, some pausing to clasp her hand, others simply nodding. The next morning life resumed again. The milk cart clattered down St. Christopher's Lane. Children darted through hedges, laughing and tossing pebbles. The baker opened his shutters, and the post arrived on time. And in her small ivy-covered cottage, Miss Marple returned to her sewing, her stories, and the small, elegant observations that so often held the key to the human heart. The case of the vicar's final confession would be discussed for years, but always in hushed tones, always with a glance over the shoulder. For everyone in Fallow Glen now knew, even the quietest people see more than they say, and no truth, however buried, remains silent forever. 3 weeks after the funeral, when the summer sun finally decided to stretch long golden fingers across Fallow Glen, an unexpected knock came at Miss Marple's door. It was Reverend Hallam, dressed less like a man of the cloth and more like someone engaged in spring cleaning. Sleeves rolled up, collar askew, and a pair of smudged spectacles perched on the tip of his nose. "Apologies, Miss Marple," he said, shifting from foot to foot, "but I've come across something in the vestry cupboard, and I wasn't quite sure what to make of it." Miss Marple, in her usual soft way, invited him in and offered tea, which he declined with apologetic gratitude. "I'm positively covered in cobwebs," before he placed a square tin on the table between them. It was a plain, battered biscuit, tin with a faded red lid and a dent on one side. The sort of tin that might have once held lemon creams or tea biscuits, but now bore the dust of a decade. "I was clearing out some of Reverend Blythe's older correspondence," Hallam explained. "Found this at the very back of the lower cupboard, behind some old parish records. Thought it was full of old notes, until I opened it." Miss Marple, her fingers light and deliberate, eased off the lid. Inside were neatly stacked papers tied with twine. On the top lay an envelope, yellowed and sealed, with "To be delivered only in the event of my death," written in the Reverend's careful hand. It was addressed not to the bishop, nor to Miss Markham, but to the Diocesan Financial Review Board. "Well," murmured Miss Marple, "how curious." The Reverend looked sheepish. "I didn't open it, of course. Thought perhaps it was best in your hands before I pass it on to the inspector." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Quite right." With delicate precision she broke the seal and unfolded the single-page letter within. Her eyes moved steadily across the paper. She did not read aloud, but when she finished, she sat back slowly, lips pressed together in that small contemplative line that often preceded revelation. "What is it?" Hallam asked. She looked up. "It appears to be a full confession, far more detailed than the letter to the bishop." Reverend Blythe outlined the entire financial scheme, how Crocombe routed funds through a series of trust shells, with Malice providing the false legal documentation. The money was drawn slowly over time, always in small increments, but over the course of years. "How much?" Hallam asked, his voice faint. "Just over £28,000, Miss Marple said. Some of it laundered through charitable events, some through phantom repairs, all documented here. He even enclosed bank records, copies." Hallam sank into a chair. "So he knew it would catch up with him?" "No," said Miss Marple gently. "I think he hoped it wouldn't. But in the end he was no longer willing to let silence protect others, not even Crocombe." There was a long pause. The soft ticking of the mantel clock seemed louder than usual. Hallam rubbed his temples. "What should I do with it?" "Give it to Inspector Trench, of course," Miss Marple said, "but I'll make a copy first if you don't mind." He agreed without hesitation. As he left, carrying the tin under one arm, Miss Marple stood at her window and watched the road toward the village green. The shops were open again. The school children were playing along the lane. But behind each scene, behind every smile and nod, she sensed the faint outlines of unease. Truth has a strange aftertaste, she thought. Even when welcomed, it changes the palate of a place. She spent the afternoon with the copied documents, laying them out like a tapestry, statements, signatures, even handwritten memos between Crocombe and Malice. There was a calculated cruelty to the way the scheme had been built, hidden beneath charity and framed by trust. And yet, there was something else. A letter tucked near the bottom, written in a different tone. It was not addressed to anyone. It was unsigned, but it was undoubtedly written by the Reverend. There is one final matter. Lydia does not know what I shielded her from, and perhaps that is for the best. She knew part of it, suspected more, but I never told her the whole truth. The money was not only stolen, part of it was offered, and I permitted it. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. It took her an hour to piece together the timeline again, with Lydia's memories as thread. The argument she overheard between the Vicar and Crocombe, the strained silences, the sudden shift in the Vicar's demeanour just weeks before his death. It wasn't just that he had decided to confess, it was why he had decided to. He had protected Lydia. That evening, Miss Marple paid another visit to Lydia Markham. The younger woman received her in the parlour this time, the furniture newly dusted, the room lit with a small reading lamp. "I thought it might be you," Lydia said. "You've that sort of step, unhurried but always arriving exactly when needed." Miss Marple smiled. "A fortunate coincidence, I'm sure." They shared tea, and after a pause, Miss Marple said, "I found another letter, unsent, about you." Lydia stiffened, but did not speak. The Reverend wrote that part of the money was offered to cover a legal difficulty, something that might have come to public light. He does not say what it was, only that he permitted it, out of a sense of care. Lydia's eyes remained fixed on her cup. "It was years ago. I was briefly engaged to a man in London. He forged my signature on several documents. I was too ashamed to prosecute and too frightened not to. Clement found out. He settled the matter quietly. Paid him off. Never told me how, only said it had been dealt with." Miss Marple placed her hand gently over Lydia's. "You did nothing wrong." Lydia blinked rapidly. "But he paid for it." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Because he loved you. Not in the romantic sense, perhaps, but in the way a good man loves those he believes he can protect." Lydia lowered her head. "He thought shielding you was worth the price," Miss Marple continued, "and in the end that's what brought him to the truth. Because hiding one sin, even a noble one, always opens the door to more." They sat together in silence. When Miss Marple returned home, the stars were already visible over the village roofs, and the air had taken on the crisp scent of elderflower. She lit a single lamp and set the copied documents in a small folder. The case was, by most standards, resolved. The death explained, the perpetrators exposed, the financial records documented. And yet, there were always small pieces that did not fit. Not in the legal sense, but in the moral one. That was the burden Reverend Blythe had carried, and now in the quiet of her parlour, it passed to her. Miss Marple folded the final page, laid it atop the others, and tied the string around the folder with the same care one might give to a parting gift. There was one more thing to do, and when the time was right she would do it. But for now the village slept, and the truth, though no longer buried, had at last been gently laid to rest. 3 more weeks passed, and summer ripened in earnest. The elder trees were heavy with blossom, the gardens of Fallow Glen were awash in colour, and the village, as villages are wont to do, began gently stitching itself back together. No one mentioned Leonard Crocombe aloud, though his absence was felt in subtle ways. The notices in the church porch were slightly less precise now, the hymn numbers not quite as straight on the wooden board. There was no longer the clatter of his keys during Sunday service, no sound of his self-important cough echoing through the nave. But people had stopped speculating, at least in public. They preferred instead to turn toward summer, toward new gossip, toward strawberry jams and flower shows and small pleasures. Graham Malice, once Gregory Mallow, was never seen in the village again. According to Constable Green, he had left quietly one morning before sunrise, boarding the early train with a single suitcase and a newspaper folded tightly beneath one arm. The investigation into his fraudulent dealings continued, of course, but the locals said nothing more of it. His name fell from conversation like an item dropped into a deep well. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved through it all with her usual gentleness, observing, never intruding. Her neighbors were polite and occasionally deferential, but they also gave her space, the way one does with someone who has recently handled something delicate and powerful. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-July, Miss Marple was visited by Raymond West, her novelist nephew, who arrived unannounced with his fashionable wife, Joan. They swept into the sitting room like a breeze from another world. Raymond, with his open collar and vague air of creative dishevelment, Joan with her Italian sunglasses and silk scarf, trailing behind her like a pennant. "Aunt Jane," Raymond said, after taking his first sip of tea, "you always look exactly the same, unruffled by the world." Miss Marple smiled. "Perhaps I'm merely good at not wearing it on my face." Joan glanced at the biscuit tin on the sideboard, the same one that had once held the Reverend's final documents. "You've had some excitement lately, haven't you? I saw something in the Times about financial misappropriation in a country parish. That wouldn't be here, would it?" Miss Marple took a delicate bite of Madeira cake. "It would." Raymond leaned forward. "You were involved, weren't you? You always are somehow, even when you're just pouring tea." Miss Marple gave a small laugh. "I only listen, Raymond. People reveal things if you let them. It's quite remarkable how eager people are. Shan't who confess when they think no one important is listening." Joan raised an eyebrow. "And what was the cause this time? Jealousy? Inheritance? Unrequited love?" "Something more tedious, I'm afraid," Miss Marple said. "Money, mostly. And pride. And the fear of being found out." Raymond groaned. "People never change. That's why I struggle to write new stories. It's always the same motives over and over." Miss Marple looked at him with a soft wisdom that rarely made it into his books. "Yes, dear, because people are the same, but how they reveal themselves, that is always new." After they left, off to dine in Norcombe at a restaurant with linen tablecloths and menus written in French, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The quiet of the evening settled around her like a well-loved shawl. Through the open window, she could hear the soft drone of bees and the rustle of wind in the hollyhocks. She sat in that hush for some time, her needles moving, her thoughts drifting. It was not until dusk had fully gathered and the cottage filled with the pale lavender of twilight that the knock came at her door. Lydia Markham stood there, holding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. "I've something for you," she said. "I've been meaning to bring it." They sat in the parlour. Lydia placed the parcel on the table and untied the key string. Inside was a book, a slim volume, worn and marked, its corners curled. The title read, "A Small Guide to Grace, Letters from a Country Clergyman." "I'm going to publish it," Lydia said softly, "or at least I'll try. It's a collection of letters the Reverend wrote over the years. Advice, consolations, quiet observations. Most weren't meant for publication, but they're beautiful. And I think the world might need them." Miss Marple turned, the book over in her hands. He would have been humbled and very proud. "I've added a note," Lydia said, "about who he was, what he stood for, and how in the end he chose truth over comfort." Miss Marple nodded. "That's the real measure of a person, I think. What they choose when no one is watching, when there's no applause." They shared tea, and Lydia departed just as the Moon began to rise. Later that night, Miss Marple lit a lamp and sat with the book in her lap. She turned to the page where a blue ribbon marked a place. The passage read, "We must not assume that silence is peace. Sometimes it is merely the breath before the confession, the hush before the tolling of truth. And when it tolls, let it not be for shame, but for release." She closed the book gently. Outside, the village slept under the quiet weight of its own story, no longer a secret, no longer a puzzle, but something lived through, endured, understood. The church bell, long silent, rang once. Midnight. Miss Marple sat in the glow of her lamp, her hands resting lightly on the book, her thoughts not of murder or fraud or even the justice that had been served, but of the small, faithful work, her of seeing clearly in a world that so often looks away. And as the sound of the bell faded into the stillness, she said to herself, as she had many times before, "People are curious things, terrible and tender, but even the darkest truth can be born if we're brave enough to hold the light a little longer." And with that she rose, turned out the lamp, and let the truth rest.